we're here. We're going to pick up where we left off when we last studied. Just as a way of reminder, we finished our last study together with our Old Testament overview. And if you remember, we did the entire Old Testament in 16 points. And most of you are like, why couldn't we just do that from the beginning? We could have skipped, 16 months of reading. But like we said, if I did that for you, it's as good as you just watching the trailer of a video instead of actually getting to watch the whole movie and getting the entire storyline and all the little interconnecting pieces that go with that. So we did it in 16 points. Those 16 points from Genesis through Malachi that we summarized the Old Testament was the creation, where we saw the beginning of all things. We talked about the fall, where the beginning of all things started to go bad. We talked about the flood, and then we talked about the Tower of Babel. And then from the Tower of Babel, we then moved to what we called the patriarchs and the matriarchs. And this is really the beginning of God's rescue plan, where what God promised in Genesis 3 begins to get feet to it in the promising of a man to make a great nation from him. And from him, God would promise to give him a land, a people, and a government. He promised him a nation that would come from him, and from that nation, all of the peoples of the earth would be blessed. We moved from the patriarchs and matriarchs. We had Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Then eventually from there, they moved into Egypt, and they were there for probably much longer than they intended to be there. They were there just about 400 years. And then God sends Moses to come and rescue them. We call it the Exodus. So we have the patriarchs and matriarchs, and then we come to the Exodus. After the Exodus, they go up to the mountain, and God gives them the law. So Moses gives them the law. This is parts of Leviticus, Exodus, and some of Numbers. We get that Mosaic law there. That's the way of ordering this group of slaves who went into Egypt. They come out, and then God gives them laws to order them to get this group of slaves that were from 70 people to maybe up to several million, how to organize their civilization, but also to teach them how to worship the God that they, to some extent, have been separated from as they've been living in this pagan culture apart from that influence. So we have Moses gives the law. We then saw that God had promised them that land, and they go and scout out that land, and they get scared because there's some big guys there. They said we're like grasshoppers in their sight. And so we end up instead wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. That's our 8th point, wandering in the wilderness. From the wilderness wandering, after the 40 years of the generation dies out that was disobedient to God, a new generation arises. God tells Moses to give the law a second time to this new generation. He basically restarts the program. That's the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronoumo, meaning second law, starts the program off again. And this time Joshua takes over because Moses is not allowed to go into the land. And this is what we call Joshua conquering the land. This is point number 9. After Joshua conquers the land, there's still some work left to be done. And that's the period of Judges, where each tribe was supposed to continue to take their territory, but most of them failed to do it and instead began to intermingle with the nations that were amongst them and became more like them instead of separated from them. And so God would have to send deliverers over to rescue them, the cycle of Judges. After another period of about 450 years, we come out of that to where the people cry, "We want a king." And so God gives them a king, and we have what's called the United Kingdom. We have a time where the entire nation is united under their king. We have 3 kings during this time: Saul, David, Solomon, in that order. They each reign for 40 years, for a total of 120 years. After that 120 years, there's a civil war, and everything falls apart. So the kingdom then becomes divided, point number 12. So we have the divided kingdom where Israel is going to be in the north. That's 10 tribes in the north. And then Judah is in the south, the 2 tribes down there. Through a series of events, the northern kingdom has about 20 kings, and they're all terrible. So terrible that God sends the Assyrians to come. They take them out, and instead of putting them in captivity like that happens later, they disperse them. So instead of putting them in one location, they scatter them across the nation of Assyria, and they are still scattered to an extent. They're never rejoined in the same way. Shortly later, the southern kingdom, who had a couple good kings, I think about 7, not very many, so their judgment was prolonged. We get then the Babylonian captivity comes because Babylon, this new world power, comes and takes the south. In the same way, it's like you tell the one child to stop doing this, and then you punish them, and then the younger one like does the same thing, and you're like, did you not, like, where were you during this time? And that's exactly what happens. They go into captivity, but God promises them this captivity is only going to be 70 years. He pulls them out of captivity after 70 years. That's the return to the land. That's point 15. We ended last time with point 16, which was the coming of the Messiah. And this point wasn't really a piece of the Old Testament narrative necessarily, but it's what our expectation was going into this New Testament. And now we come where the focus specifically tonight on the Gospels. Now, you've already, if you're following along with the reading plan, you've already read Matthew, Mark, and you finished Luke just the other day. But what we're going to do is we're going to give you super high overview of those Gospels, talk about some of the differences between them, because they're not the same content, but there's some changes in that depending on who the audience they're talking to, what is their purpose in writing. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit, and then we will be starting John tomorrow. So we're going to go into greater detail on John. I'll give you a high-level outline of John, and then over the coming weeks, what we'll do is we'll dig deeper as you guys read and kind of review what you've been reading each week in the book of John. Let's see. The Gospels, if we were to look at them, they're the first 4 books of your New Testament. They comprise about 46% of that. And the early church placed them at the beginning of your New Testament canon, not because they were the first books that were written, but because they were the foundation upon which all of the other books would rest. The Greek word euangelion, it's this word that refers to glad tidings or good news, which is what we call the gospel. And it's about Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. And this term would later be used to describe the books that tell this same account of this gospel. When we look at some of the other books in the Old Testament, we notice that there were several different genres of literature. And we talked about how it's important to understand and read each of these books with a different understanding, right? So if you read Genesis the same way you read Proverbs, you're going to have a problem. If you read Proverbs the same way you read Isaiah, you will be thoroughly confused all the time, because in the same way that you wouldn't read a cookbook the way you would read a fiction novel, you're going to have confusion there. If you do, we have to talk. There may be some issues. In the same way in the New Testament, there's different genres, and it's important to understand that when you're reading to understand what's going on. The Gospels have a genre parallel in ancient world, which is called the bios. This would be an ancient bibliography, or biography, Rather than focusing on physical description and tracing psychological thinking and personal development like modern biographies would, the development of an individual necessarily, a bios highlights the key events that surrounded the person and their teaching. This is very much what the Gospels do, and the key characteristics of Jesus as God carries out the plan, and Jesus carrying out the plan of the Father is kind of the focus of that. Though the Gospels are historical writings, they're not presented in a strictly chronological fashion, since some scenes and things are organized differently. For example, in Mark chapter 2, verse 1 through 3:6, he reports 5 conversations in a row that Matthew is going to spread out across Matthew 8 through 12. And so it's important to remember that when we're reading this, the author themselves is not concerned about a strict timeline the way we might be, and that bothers some of us, myself included, so we just need to remind ourselves of that. Some of the events and conversations have been reorganized to highlight different theological points, not necessarily be in linear timeline. So sometimes when they're putting stories together, it's not because they necessarily happen together, it's because they tell the same point. A lot of times in Jewish teaching, again, repetition is really the issue. So when you see that, this is a key. Even though the Gospels offer a variety of accounts, they all share the view that Jesus is the promised Messiah, uniquely related to God to bring his promise of salvation. 3 of the Gospels are called the Synoptics because they overlap in many places. They tell the story from the same perspective, more or less would be another way of saying it. Where am I going here? Mark is going to start, they all start kind of even from a similar place. Mark starts with John the Baptist, while Matthew and Luke start with Jesus' unique birth. So they start with Jesus in that way. John, however, tells the story in a very much different way, where John is actually going to start, it sounds a lot like Genesis, more than it does where Jesus is coming on the scene through his baptism. He starts with the pre-incarnate Word becoming flesh, and his presentation of Jesus as the Son of God is more direct and explicit. So there's a difference between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, how they tell about Jesus in some ways, than how John does, and we'll get into a little bit of that. But just so that you know that. Lastly, we want to remember that the New Testament comes after the Old Testament. I know this might be a surprise, hopefully not, but the New Testament comes afterwards, and it's important to remember that because we read a bunch of stuff already. And a lot of times I think people read the New Testament and not remembering that there's a bunch of other stuff that already happened. Luke 24, one of the last chapter of Luke that we read just a couple days ago, there's this account on the road to Emmaus where these two guys are walking down the road, and Jesus meets up with them, and they're all upset, and Jesus is like, why are you upset? And they explain, this guy just died, he got buried in the tomb, we're not even sure where he is now. And towards the end of that, let me see if I can find it here. Verse 24, 25. And he said to them, O foolish ones, and how slow of heart to believe all the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter the glory? And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them all the scriptures, the things concerning himself. Moses and the prophets is a nice way of summarizing everything that Moses wrote, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and the prophets being the rest of the Old Testament. So he's basically saying all of the Old Testament points to me. And so from this seed that would crush the head of the serpent in Genesis 3 to the eternal king promised to David in 2 Samuel 7, all the time that we've been reading has been building up to what we now read in the Gospels. So we will now kind of get into, we're going to do, again, high-level overview of each of these books, and then we'll get into the outline for John. We'll try to skim through this because there's quite a bit. Again, this is just top level. Traditionally, the Gospel of Matthew was penned by the apostle carrying the same name, Matthew. The Gospel was written for people familiar with the Old Testament, both the law of Moses and the prophets. Matthew makes references to the Old Testament more than any of the other gospel writers. There are at least 60 references to the Old Testament throughout the book. And we made note of that as you started Matthew. I'd be like, this is in fulfillment of yada, yada, yada. And he quotes the Old Testament a ton. Traditionally, the book is dated, in the late 50s to early 60s AD. And it was written, again, with a Jewish or a Jewish convert audience in mind. Again, because they would have been familiar with all the other Old Testament writings. So he's writing as like, remember this thing that you read as a kid? This is the fulfillment of that. Two things that are unique to Matthew are the account of Jesus as a child. So some of that beginning early narrative is unique to Matthew. And also the famous Sermon on the Mount is only found in the Gospel of Matthew. So some things that are unique to his. Matthew takes care to show us how Jesus fulfills the prophecies made about him earlier in the Bible, especially focusing on Jesus' role as the Messiah, this promised king, this Messiah king. That's really the focus of Matthew. So he's saying, remember all of this stuff, remember that Davidic line. He's pointing all of that out in that. Matthew is really the perfect book to kind of bridge the gap between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And in the famous Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, do not think that I have come to abolish the law of the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. So again, Matthew is talking about these Old Testament pieces and how Jesus is the fulfillment of that. So those are some of the characteristics of that first gospel, Matthew. Then we move on to the next one, the book of Mark. This is the shortest gospel out of the four. In fact, it's possible the gospel was even written to be easily memorized and told out loud. It's fast-paced with a lot of movement and action. The external and internal data most convincingly points to Rome as the place that it was written, and a date of Mark in somewhere in the late or mid to late 50s AD. This was most likely the first gospel that was written, and it was probably used as a source material for Matthew and Luke. And so that's part of why they're called the synoptics, where they're from the same perspective, because we think Mark was written first, and then Matthew and Luke both used them as source material in writing theirs. John, we don't think did, and we'll get a little bit into that why. According to the early church tradition, the gospel was written by a man named John Mark. This is the same guy who he ended up backing out as a missionary with Paul and Barnabas in Acts 15. So we'll see this character again when we get to Acts. He's on kind of this missionary trip. He gets cold feet, hops out, and then Paul doesn't want to take him. Barnabas does, and there's a friction there between the two of them because of him. Mark purportedly aided the apostle Peter later in life, and this gospel is an arrangement or a collection of Peter's memories of Jesus. So this book is actually an account of Peter's remembrance of what's going on, written by John Mark, this other man. And so that's where you notice it when you get to the nitty-gritty details on who's telling the stories and what pieces they're omitting. You're like, oh, this story about Peter is omitted because it's not like a great story. Like there's other pieces that hint to that throughout that. There's another interesting note. At the end of Mark, there's like 2 verses when Jesus is being arrested, and it's in Mark chapter 14, verses 51 and 52. So right as Jesus is getting arrested, it says, "And a young man followed him with nothing but a loincloth around his body, and they seized him, but he left the loincloth and ran away naked." We think that's John Mark in the middle of this narrative, and so you have him showing up as the unnamed naked guy at the end of Jesus' arrest. You didn't know there was a naked guy at Jesus' arrest, but now you do. That's in Mark 14, verse 51 and 52. Mark was written to a wider audience than Matthew, probably Roman and Gentile believers. It was written in basic Greek, and Mark is actually going to explain Jewish customs and define Aramaic words to help non-Jewish readers. And so Mark is going to give you a little bit more help on what's going on than Matthew does. Matthew has a higher expectation because of who his audience is. The gospel focuses on Jesus' role as the suffering servant and the Son of God. And there's more emphasis on the actions of Jesus other than the teachings of Jesus. So Matthew's more about the teaching, more about the words that Jesus said. Mark's more concerned about what Jesus is doing. While the other Gospels contain long discourses of sermons of Jesus, Mark is about the action. This is where we see Jesus doing things and then doing more things. It's very action-oriented, and oftentimes you'll see the word immediately or frequently. It's like Jesus healed this man, and like immediately he leaves, and you're like, well, that's kind of weird, because that's just how Mark is telling the story. And again, Mark reads like this the entire time. The third gospel is the Gospel of Luke. It's the one that we just finished. This is the longest of the 4 gospels. In fact, it's the longest book in the New Testament. Luke was a historian, and he was a journalist, and he wrote a thorough account of the episodes of Jesus' life arranged in chronological order. This gospel was also written to help establish believers in the teachings of Jesus. We get the kind of the point of this from Luke, the first 4 verses of Luke 1. Luke says, "Insomuch as has been undertaken to compile a narrative of the thing that has been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, it seems good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account to you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught." Both Luke chapter 1, verse 3 and Acts 1:1 are addressed to this character Theophilus, and there is no reason to deny that this was a real person, although attempts to identify him have really been unsuccessful. Luke uses the same description, most excellent, in the book of Acts to describe the Roman governor Felix and Festus. So Theophilus was probably a man of wealth and high social standing, and most excellent serves as a respectful form of address to this man. Luke is a collection of eyewitness accounts, and the earliest possible date for Luke and Acts is immediately after the events that Luke records in Acts 28, which would be 62 AD. In fact, Luke could have been writing slightly earlier, and Acts could have been completed after that time. When we get into Acts, you'll find out that Luke also wrote Acts. And the way Acts ends, it almost feels like there's another book, but there's not. But between Luke and Acts, he actually wrote more of the New Testament than Paul did, which when you think about all the letters, you're like, no, he didn't. But Luke's a pretty long book, and Acts is 28 chapters, but out of total content, Luke wrote more than Paul did. Luke's broader intended audience consists primarily of Gentile Christians like Theophilus, who had already been, quote-unquote, taught about Jesus, but Luke no doubt recognizes that his recounting of Jesus' life and message would also be useful for evangelism among non-Christians. Church tradition recognizes the first century physician Luke again as the author and the editor of the book, which is how it gets its name. Luke is also probably a Gentile, and he may be one, if not the only, non-Hebrew author of the Bible, which we pick up on a few clues throughout the New Testament. So we don't think Luke was a Jew, but Luke was a Gentile. This gospel presents Jesus as the seeking Savior of all the nations. We get that in Luke 2:30 and 32. Really, Luke is presenting Jesus as, in fact, the perfect man, this different portrait of Jesus. So we had this coming Messiah, now you have the perfect man, and it was and continues to be this rich story of Jesus' life and ministry for both those who don't know much about Jesus and those who have a great deal of familiarity through the Old Testament. So it's kind of a good balanced book between all of the ones that we've looked at so far. Lastly, kind of a high-level overview of John. That date is wrong, so don't pay attention to that date. I'll tell you why in a minute. John was written long after the other Gospels. John was probably written between 85 and 95 AD, so scratch late 50, 60. It's not. It's 85 to 90 AD. We believe that John was written by the Apostle John, who throughout the book refers to himself as the one whom Jesus loved. John was one of the closest disciples of Jesus, and he witnessed the transfiguration. He was one of the first at the empty tomb, and he lived longer than any of the other disciples. He is also the author of such books as 1 John and 2 John and 3 John and Revelation. He's not really great at naming books, but he's got four named after him, and then Revelation. John is the persuasive gospel. It's written to show the miracles of Jesus so that those who read the story will believe in him and have everlasting life. John's account of Jesus' teaching and miracles emphasize the divine nature of Jesus. And to John, Jesus is the cosmic Son of God, come to destroy the works of the devil, and the whole book is arranged to present Jesus in this way. That means that the Gospel of John has a very different feel from the other three. The way the Gospel starts is a good example. Again, Mark begins with Jesus' baptism. Again, John begins with in the beginning, in the same way Genesis does, talking about Jesus and who everything was created. And then this one who created everything comes to the world who rejects him. But all who do receive him would have everlasting life. It's a completely different feel around that. So that's the Gospel of John. That's the 4 books in overview. But now we're going to spend the rest of our time tonight really digging into the book of John itself, talking about a detailed overview of that. And then each week, like I said, we'll get into what you were reading each week and talk about the individual stories. But tonight, again, high-level overview of the book. Again, the Gospel of John is unique compared to the other 3. It's not part of the synoptic Gospels. It tells the story from a different perspective. And even though it covers the account of Jesus from a different perspective and was written for a different audience, it does not mainly cover the same content as the others. A lot of the Gospel of John is unique to the Gospel. 92% of John is unique to its own book compared to the other ones. And so that's part of the reason we don't think that he used Mark, again, as that source material the same way that Luke and Matthew did, because so much of John's is just by itself. And that's also a reason why we think he wrote later. The other ones might have used the source material, and then John picks up these other stories that may not have been told in the previous Gospels, to write his account. John draws mainly upon events and conversations that were not found in the others, and uses them to persuade the reader that Jesus is in fact God in the flesh. The purpose of the book can be seen at the end of chapter 20 in verses 30 through 31. So this is kind of the purpose statement that John stamps at the end of his book. He says, "Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book." And I guess the implication would be they're not written in the other books either. Jesus did a lot. But they are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. John wrote to display the divinity of Jesus, that he was the eternal Word that had come to earth, born to die as God's sacrifice for human sin. John does this primarily through two ways. He talks about 7 miraculous signs that proves that Jesus is the Christ. Jesus' identity is also further revealed in the 7 I am statements. Remember, 7 is this number of completion. It goes back to Genesis. God completed the creation in 6 days, and on the 7th day he rested. So it's like this nice round, not really round, but in the Bible it's this whole number. It means fulfillment in a way, right? And so John uses these 7 miracles, these 7 signs, and these 7 I am statements as a way to show who Jesus is. John's gospel is topical. It's not primarily chronological, and it revolves again around these 2 groups of 7. As far as the author, we've talked about this a little bit, but internal and external evidence point to the Apostle John as the author of the book. Again, he was one of the 12 who was with Jesus during his Galilean ministry, and he was present at his crucifixion. I think he was the only of the 12 that was actually present during the crucifixion, because remember, the rest of them had scattered away. That's why Jesus will tell John, Mary, John, this is your mother. Mary, this is your son, where he's basically telling John that it's your responsibility to take care of my mom now that I'm going. John was apparently among the Galileans who had been following part of John the Baptist until he was called by Jesus at the start of his public ministry. So we looked at that a little bit a few weeks ago in our Encountering Jesus series, where that first week we talked about the beginning of kind of Jesus calling his disciples, and we talked about Nathan and Bartholomew. But the beginning of that, we talked about how John the Baptist had some disciples, and Jesus was calling some of those. John was probably one of those in that group. John is mentioned in part of the book as the disciple whom Jesus loved. That's the title he gives himself. He kind of thinks a little highly of himself and his relationship with Jesus. John was not only a part of the 12, but again, he was a part of this inner circle, this group of 3 comprised by Peter, James, and John. So there's the 12, which are kind of the inner circle of Jesus' disciples, because remember, there's others. There's the 70, and there's other groups of people. And then inside that 12, there's another inner circle, and he's one of those in that closer-knit inner circle. After Christ's ascension, John becomes one of the pillars of the church in Jerusalem, along with James and Peter, according to Galatians 2. He is also mentioned 3 times by name in the book of Acts, and each time is in association with Peter. So John becomes a bigger figure in the history of the church, in the beginning of the church growing, in the beginning of Acts, when we get there in a few weeks. Tradition says that John went to Ephesus, and he would later be exiled by the Romans for a time to isolate in a time of isolation at the island of Patmos, from where he would write the book of Revelation. So John was probably in Ephesus for a time as an elder at the church of Ephesus from the book of Ephesians, that same church. He probably wrote his gospel and the other books while he was there. He was later exiled to Patmos, where he would then write Revelation from. Again, the date of the Gospel of John was probably between 85 and 95 AD. Some critics have attempted to assign a date as late as AD 150 on the basis of the book's has some issues with it. He takes some issue with Gnostic teaching, which we can get into later, but that becomes more prominent later on. And because it feels like John is addressing that, they feel like the date should be later. But archaeological finds supporting the authenticity of the text of John with different manuscripts that have been discovered, and the Dead Sea Scrolls have given powerful support to the dating of John as we've presented it. So it's common today to find scholars arguing even an earlier date, but that also doesn't make sense. But in earlier date, it's possible the gospel has been known for a long time in church history as the fourth gospel, so we think it's written a little bit later, again, when John is an older man, sometime between 85 and 95. Kind of a way that we know this is when you start getting like deeper into Bible stuff, you get these cool things. This is the Rylands Papyrus of the Gospel of John. It's dated somewhere between 100 and 125 AD. This is also what's known as P52. It's originally an Egypt manuscript of the Gospel of John, translated in Greek. It contains part of 7 lines from John 18, verses 31 through 33, and the back contains 7 lines from John 18, 37 to 38. Again, the papyrus has been dated between 100 and 125 AD. Jesus' death is dated between 30 AD and 33 AD, which means that the translation of the Gospel of John was already being circulated in Egypt as early as 70 years after Jesus' death. And so if that's happening, if it's already moved from Rome to Egypt, that kind of gives us an idea of where that date is. This is things about the size of a postcard, of a business card. It's really tiny. But something like this is what gives us the evidence that we think that John was written during this date. When comparing the Gospel of John to the 3 other Gospels, John again gives a very unique and distinct perspective on Jesus. John does not include Jesus' genealogy, his birth, his baptism, the temptation, the casting out of demons, parables, transfiguration, or the institution of the Lord's Supper, his agony in Gethsemane, or his ascension. So he leaves out like a ton of stuff. But John's presentation of Jesus rather stresses his ministry in Jerusalem, the feast of the Jewish nation, Jesus' contacts with individuals or private conversations, and his ministry to his disciples. So the content of John is not as much public as it is personal. So like the woman at the well story that we looked at, it's a conversation between Jesus and an individual. The story of Nicodemus is another story of Jesus between an individual. These one-on-one conversations, or Jesus teaching his disciples. There's not as much public ministry as the other ones. It doesn't mean it's not there. It's just not as much of the focus. The bulk of the gospel is contained in, again, what's called the book of signs. This is a subsegment of the gospel. It's from chapter 2 through chapter 12, which again talks about these 7 signs which proclaim Jesus as the Messiah. The book of signs also contains great discourses of Jesus which explain and proclaim the significance of the signs. For example, following the feeding of the 5,000 in John 6, Jesus reveals himself as the bread of life, which the Heavenly Father gives for the life of the world. That's in John chapter 6, 25 through 35. So even some of these I am statements, you'll notice there's the miracle, and it's mostly the later ones. I think it's like 3, 4, and 5. There's a couple of them where the I am statement lines up with one of those miracles that's happening, and this is one of those situations. Another notable exclusive feature of the fourth gospel, again, is those I am statements which were made by Jesus. The remainder of the book consists of what is known as the Upper Room Discourse and the crucifixion narrative. So half of the book is these signs and these statements. So when you read through it, just note that. When we look at the outline, we're really going to give it 4 or 5 kind of chunks. The beginning is really the prologue. This is the testimony where he talks about, again, we'll read about in the beginning and talks about how Jesus, and kind of comparing that Genesis account to applying that to Jesus as the creator. Then we have the section of the proclamation of John the Baptist saying, "Behold, the Lamb of God who would take away the sins of the world." So it immediately starts off with this kind of declaration of public ministry. The prologue concludes with the calling of the first disciples, which we looked at again several weeks ago. And then that's basically the prologue short. It's like a chapter. It's just chapter 1. So chapter 1 is the prologue. Then we come to the signs sections, the signs of the Messiah. The first half, again, really talking about the identity of Jesus being displayed through these miraculous works. The 7 signs, just so you know when you get there, are the changing of the water into wine at Cana in chapter 2, the healing of the official son in Capernaum, that's chapter 4, the healing of an individual at the pool of Bethsaida in Jerusalem, that's going to be in chapter 5, the feeding of the 5,000 near the Sea of Galilee, the walking on water at the Sea of Galilee, the healing of the blind man in Jerusalem, and the raising of the dead of Lazarus in Bethany. And then the 7 I am statements, again, some of those correspond chapter-wise to the events that happen. So I am the bread of life is happening just after the feeding of the 5,000. I am the light of the world. I am the gate for the shepherd. I am the good shepherd. Remember, we looked at even that statement back when we were looking at Jeremiah and some of those other statements where we had these false teachers and stuff, and then God promised that there would be one who would be the capital good shepherd in Jeremiah, referencing back to Jesus. I am the resurrection and the life. That happens at the same time as the Lazarus story, where Lazarus is being raised from the dead. So some of those, again, correspond to each other. I'm the way, the truth, and the life. Now, just note these last 2, and I'm the true vine. Those are happening in the next section. They're not in the sign section, those 7 signs. So the last 2, 6 and 7, as far as the I am statements, happen later on in the story, but just so you know what those are. So the bread of life, light of the world, gate for the sheep, the good shepherd, the resurrection and life, the way, the truth, and the life, and then the true vine are those 7 I am statements. The second section ends with a reference to the Jewish nation rejection of the Messiah. End of chapter 12, verse 36, it says, "When Jesus had said these things, he departed and hid himself from them. Though he had done so many signs before them, they still did not believe him." So this is the end of that sign section, right? He did so many signs and they did not believe him. So the words spoken by the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled. "Lord, who has believed what we have heard from us? To whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed?" Therefore they could not believe. For again Isaiah said, "He has blinded their eyes and hardened their hearts, lest they see with their eyes and understand with their hearts and turn. I would heal them." Isaiah said these things before he saw his glory and spoke of him. Nevertheless, many even of the authorities believed in him, but for fear of the Pharisees, they did not confess it, so they would not be put out of the synagogue. For they love the glory that comes from man more than the glory that comes from God. So this is kind of the summary statement of these sign sections at the end of chapter 12. Chapter 13 through 17 is the next section. This is the upper room discourse, this middle section. Jesus has now been rejected by the Jews, and now he turns his attention to this new messianic community, this discipleship group, which will become the church shortly. In the second major section of John's gospel, Jesus prepares his new messianic community, represented by these 12, minus Judas, for the time before he is exalted to the Father. The community is cleansed both literally and symbolically through the washing of the feet, and then figuratively through the removal of the betrayer. So there's cleansing within this group. And now John has previously surveyed the public ministry of Jesus. He now makes a massive shift in the following 5 chapters, and he gives a detailed account of some critical hours. So we go from Jesus' entire ministry over 12 7 high points, 7 key points that John pulled out over the course of 3 years, to 5 chapters on just one night. Here, Jesus prepares them for the coming departure, detailing the new commandment for this fledgling community to be identified by loving one another and the assurance of him as the only means to find restoration with the Father. That statement where I am the way, the truth, and the life. Jesus then promises them a future helper in the Holy Spirit after his departure. He then tells them of the challenges that will be with them once he leaves, sharing with them again that the world has rejected him and they will also reject them. And so he reminds them of that rejection that we just read about, that the Jews had done for them, they're also going to do to this group. But he reminds them to have courage since he has overcome the world, and that's where that verse is found. The section ends with chapter 17, which is what's known as the high priestly prayer, where he not only prays for his disciples, the starting community, but he also prays for all of those who would one day put their faith in him. John chapter 17, starting verse 20, it says, "I do not ask for these only, but also for those who will believe in me through their word." That would mean those who believe because of the word of these disciples. "That they may be all one, just as you, Father, are in me, and I in you, that they may also be in us, that the world may believe that you have sent me." It's the end of the upper room discourse, and then we come to the crucifixion and the resurrection. If you look at some outlines, they will kind of combine these last two pieces. I've split them up a little bit differently, and I'll explain why. But first, we have the crucifixion piece of this as the separate. This is just 18, 19, and the first 10 verses of chapter 20. After recording his high priestly prayer, John immediately launches into a dramatic description of Jesus' arrest and trial before Ananias, Caiaphas, and Pilate. In his crucifixion, we see that Jesus willingly fulfills the proclamation of John the Baptist at the beginning of the book, where he says, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." That's John 1:29. At the end, we have the resurrection and the visitation. This is in chapters 20 verse 11 through 21. Is the kind of the epilogue of the book, and John includes Jesus' resurrection and then the appearance to several groups of people after having been raised from the dead. We see him seeing Mary Magdalene. He visits the 12. He visits the 7. He visits Thomas. So it's Jesus' resurrection carried into these little interactions that he has before he leaves. There are 5 different visitations by Jesus after the resurrection to various groups of the disciples. And that's the basic overview of the book of John. So 5 pieces: that prologue, the signs section, the upper room discourse, the crucifixion, and then this resurrection and visitation piece kind of wraps up the book. So again, you guys will be starting reading tomorrow. And if you need it, I have a copy of the reading plan, which kind of lays it all out for you. Or if you can pick it up online at gulfygrace.org, go under resources, and you can download it there. The reading plan for those who are new has your reading for each day. You'll be reading a portion of the New Testament, and then you'll have a portion of the Psalms or Proverbs that we're reading alongside of that. If you have to pick one, just pick whatever one, but pick the one that we're going through, because what we're going to do is when we come back next week, we're going to be reviewing everything that we read between Thursday and Wednesday. And so we'll be going through in more detail these stories and the content from these sections and kind of breaking it down. And then we'll continue this all the way through the rest of the New Testament as we did the Old Testament. So thank you guys very much. If you have any questions, you can come see me. Remember, we have our email if you need anything. If you lose something, if you need one of the videos or you can't find it, or if you have a specific question you want to ask, you can always email me at anchored. I don't remember. Just do my regular email. Why did I do this to myself? Just do mark@gulfygrace.org, and you can just send me an email through that. And then I'll get that, and I'll kind of give you an answer in the next day or so once you email me if you have any questions. But thank you guys so much, and we will see you here Sunday morning.